Beautiful Music presents Going Mental, a podcast discussing mental health from a personal to global scale. I'm your host, Eric Leibowitz, founder of Beautiful Music. Let's go mental. Today on the episode, we have Rafe Stepto. Rafe, how are you doing today?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you for having me, Eric.
Oh, it is such a pleasure. Rafe and I were in school together at NYU, and I'm so excited to have you as our first guest on the podcast.
Wonderful. Exciting.
So please, Rafe, if you don't mind just sharing a little bit about yourself and what you do and what led you there and anything else you feel like you'd like to share, please, that'd be great.
So, going off your introduction, I am a creative arts therapist. I'm a music therapist. I'm a musician. That kind of goes with the territory. I am a lapsed agnostic. I am a father. I'm a husband. I try to be a member of my community. I say all those things by way of trying to give you a sense of, what I find to be important to me in adult life.
Yes.
Yeah, and as far as my music therapy practice goes, I work primarily, almost exclusively, with children. It wasn't always the case in my career. I started out working with children at the Brooklyn Conservatory of Music, but also working in a medical setting, usually end of life, hospice, palliative care, in that. With that kind of population. But, like so many people before me, my practice has increasingly focused as I've gone. And I work with younger people, often in a trauma-informed way, although there is a part of my practice that also focuses on developmental delays, such as autism, such as apraxia, those things as well.
Wow, it's so fascinating to just hear that journey and your experience, and who you are, and I have so many questions. My question for you next is kind of a two-part question. How does music inform your work? What does music therapy look like in the work that you're doing now with children? And how does your previous work with adults and hospice care and even who you are? You were talking about being a musician and a father and a member of your community and lapsing agnostic. How does all of that combine to give you your philosophy as a music therapy, and how does it manifest in your work?
Wow, that's a lot.
So
if I have to come back and ask you to break, to unpack it further, forgive me.
So the main question I am thinking of in what you were saying is, how does music manifest in your work? What does music therapy look like?
Well, starting with music is central to my practice. I am completely and utterly grateful that I happen to have clients come through my door who are there in part for the music. There's a certain filter in my practice and in the institutions I work for where people are coming for the music and coming to find the therapy in the music. I very much am a music obsessive. Music is one of the things in my life that I don't grow tired of. That was its role for me probably from 14 or 15 on, of just this thing I wanted to be in all the time, like a musician, like any other musician. And I get to apply and I get to live that in the practice, and I tend to get to be with clients who are like that, especially in part because they are children. One of the main differences perhaps between working with children and working with people who, in hospice, for example, where obviously the population skews to the elderly, is that with children you don't really have to talk them into the fact that they are already musicians, or at least not as much.
Yes.
Um, you know, I think every music therapist at some point, either in their training or in their practice, has heard an adult say, "Oh, I don't have any music talent. Oh, my sister has a musical ear. I do not.
Hmm. Hmm.
Could you just play some stuff for me and I will listen?" Which is also valid. You know, like as you know, in our profession, you know, we call that receptive listening,
Hmm.
and we often get taught that listening is a creative act, so it's very valid. But you know, I do want people to engage, uh, if it if it seems appropriate, with their own creativity, with their own voice, and therefore their own self. Um, so, in a nutshell, I think that's one of the things that music does. It's a way of talking to ourselves. Um,
Wow,
you
I
know,
love that.
it's such a funny thing. You know,
Hmm.
music so uniquely, efficiently good at getting people to connect to each other and to quote unquote speak to each other. Well, the same applies internally. It's a very good way to talk to ourselves. Um, and so, yeah, music, starting with the music. Now, this is the point where I need to ask you to unpack the question
Sh-
again.
Sure. So I mean, to also acknowledge what you're saying about this speaking with the music through the music, this
Hmm.
idea is bringing up more questions, but I also want to respect your you wanting to go back to unpacking the first question, and maybe I can combine my new question with this. How does your music and your experiences guide the music therapy session? And are you finding that you are seeing a lot of new music happening, like creating music, or
Hmm.
is there familiar music? How does it happen for you in the work that you're doing with children?
Generally, new music.
Mhm.
Um,
Meaning like
and
improvisation and songwriting.
Sure,
Yes.
exactly. And new beat making, you
Mm.
know, I mean, you know, it's 2020 and a lot of the, and this is New York City.
Hmm.
And so I work with countless kids who their perception of what music isn't necessarily, or isn't, um, you know, a bunch of guys sitting around a circle with acoustic guitars,
Yeah.
which was a scene that I was certainly familiar with at 13.
Hmm.
I had an older brother who played guitar, and my first experiences of being intrinsically motivated with music, as opposed to, you know, in my piano lessons and all that kind of thing, were in these improvisation circles, generally around rock and roll and folk
Hmm.
and a little bit of funk, uh,
Nice.
but you know, really around the language of acoustic guitar or
Hmm.
guitar in general.
I
And
see.
so, just these, you know, it's a long-winded answer, but yeah, new music and a lot of beat making. You know,
Mhm.
these kids generally associate music with a digital environment.
Yes.
And that's often where we start because that is what's familiar. And the kids, you know, as their interest grows and as their feeling of the competence grows within the musical setting, invariably, um, you know, they point to an instrument and they say, "Can we start to work on that?" You know, an acoustic instrument,
Hmm. Hmm.
and that becomes part of their toolbox as well.
Beautiful. And nothing more relevant than technology in
Oh yeah.
today's day, where not only the advances in technology allowing for creating new music and new sounds, if not better sounding, more easily and more accessible to more people. And now
Hmm.
that most work is being done through remote services, like our podcast now is being recorded on Zoom,
Hmm.
the implications of being informed as a therapist with the new technology is so important, and being up to date with what your clients are using.
Absolutely.
But also as a therapist, it doesn't limit you to connect with your clients, because you what you bring to the table is still valid, even though there's differences, and then there's a melding and growth that can happen there too. Would you say?
It's such a funny thing. I'm 45 years old,
Mm,
and I have super vivid memories of
mm,
being, um, I guess, around 9 or 10 years old, and trying to get the dial on the radio just right so that I could so that I could get DJ Red Alert's set from New York City. Like,
wow.
so, there's all this talk about joining the kids in their music, and I'm like, wait a minute, it's mine too. I was a kid.
Mm,
I was 9, 10 years old, literally just moving the dial. It felt like nanometers,
mm,
uh, to try and get this new sound out of the speakers and into me. And that new sound was hip hop. That new sound was beats.
mm,
Uh, because prior to that, I knew, of course, my parents' record collection, and I knew the Beatles, and I knew Bob Marley, and uh, Motown. You know,
mhm, mhm. Wow. Yeah, that's in
I
encouraging,
mean,
because
that's me at 9. 30 some odd years, whatever, however long ago. You know.
and I think there are different philosophies of how much you bring into a therapy session.
Hmm.
And I wonder what your thoughts on this are, because I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, I wonder if it's really possible to eliminate yourself completely in music therapy, because your music is coming out. Um, as were saying, finding the music to speak for you.
Hmm.
We also have our musical voices as therapists.
Sure.
Really, you, and not
I
that detriment. It's just part of the therapeutic relationship.
Yeah. I guess, I mean, my first the first words that come to mind when I hear you speak just now is that I wouldn't want to uh, eliminate myself at all
Hmm.
from the process, because without me in the equation, who is the client going to develop a relationship with?
Yes.
I mean, you know, obviously the goal of therapy is how a person relates to themselves,
Hmm.
but the therapeutic relationship is kind of the gym where they work out that muscle. And so, a relationship with me as I am, as I truly am, I think is always valid.
Hmm.
Of course, there are boundaries there, and of course, it's like, our job is to, unlike talking to a friend who's a good listener, when you come to a therapist, um, the therapist's goals, for you, are usually far more focused
Mm.
and rigorous, right? And
Yes.
and there's a degree of training that goes beyond having a knack for listening. Um, but I would not want to disappear from the process, because I believe in relationship.
And speaking of relationships and goals and the clinical work, I'm wondering if you would share something that you've seen happen in your work. Obviously, um, keeping confidentiality between
Hmm.
between your clients. If there's anything that you think really demonstrates a beautiful or healing moment that has happened in your work as a music therapist.
Huh. God, pick one. Um,
Or a few, just what would demonstrate the the efficiency, the effectiveness, or the power. I don't want to speak too woo woo about it, but there are some beautiful things that happen in music therapy that I have seen, and it's just beautiful
Yeah,
to hear about other
yeah,
people's work too. So
yeah.
anything
It is. I so second that. I mean, one thing I will say about this profession is that, and I don't feel like I'm overstating this at all. Like you actually get to witness the, like the sublime
mm,
from time to time.
wow, that's a great way
Um,
of putting it.
do you know what I mean? Like the
Totally.
whether it's something that's happening internally for the client, or again, um, between the client and the therapist, and it can be aesthetic. It could be purely about the music, or it could be about the client's relationship to something.
Mm,
And there are times when it's really sublime. A kind of I get an example of just really of this moment is I uh, screen addiction comes up. Given the population I work with, screen addiction comes up all the time, and the
wow.
effects of screen use come up all the time.
Mm,
And recently, in working with somebody whose life is whose young life is so tied into video games, and one in particular, uh, that video game that's currently at war with a large tech company,
mm,
and it's a very dominant game amongst young males.
mm,
Um, you know, and there's tension in this child's home because of his because of um, you know his relationship to video games. But here's where music can become useful. These video games all have music or soundtracked,
mm.
right,
Yeah.
embedded, and then players of these video games, inspired by these worlds, make their own songs, which they then immediately put up on YouTube.
Oh, wow.
Uh, and so there's this whole genre of music uh, that's defined by how it references this video game.
Huh.
And so, we can learn some of these songs together and get at the music that way, because there is a community of content creators. Do I throw this video game out? Do I throw the community of it out and try to wean this child off of that? Or do we find the creativity within it,
Mm,
and find a new way of relating to it? I mean, personally, and again, this could be my own stuff. I would very much like, uh, you know, I feel that it's important that people feel that they can create their own things, right?
yes,
And
completely.
not simply consume content. I distrust that dynamic as much as anyone. But we can go into these kind of worlds of consumption and find the creativity, and in so doing, the kids recognize that you aren't judging them.
Mm,
And a child said that to me recently. They're like, "You're the only one that will join me here in this world that I'm into." Um, and perhaps his phrasing was a little dramatic, but it's a dramatic age,
it's true.
right?
And powerful
And
nonetheless.
and powerful nonetheless, and something that we can work with, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, which kind of ties into I love the concept of your business, of this channel, of
Mm,
of creative arts, of therapy and Buddhism. Um, some of the most kind of ancient lessons we have. Uh, and
Thanks for saying that, Rafe.
Yeah, absolutely. And the clinical example I was just bringing up makes me think of non-judgment.
Mm,
You know,
yes.
um, and which, you know, which is not the same as permissiveness,
Mm.
right?
Yes.
And 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 how that can be, how this can be a basis for therapeutic relationship, and so on and so forth. And the therapy progresses from there.
You know, there's so much to what you said, and thank you so much for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
I think the idea that I just want to emphasize is the recontextualization of experiences, the reframing that you're doing in your work is
Mm-hmm.
so important, and so important in my philosophy too, is that we can't eliminate these challenges. It's the way
No,
we view them and the way that we re recontextualize them. I forget exactly what word you use, but like looking at it in a different way and being at it and finding new ways to be with something and coming at it within music and in a way of creativity really does help to see it objectively and at least in a new way, which can always be helpful.
totally, totally. I could not agree more.
Mm.
Um, we are contextual animals, um, and I think we're also deeply sensitive um, to judgment,
Yeah.
and things like that. I mean, one of the things that I used to be kind of insecure about it, I was a self-taught musician, as I kind of hinted at before. I came up in very much a kind of jamming
Mhm.
environment,
Yeah.
improvisatory environment. I did not come up formally. There was a long period of time when I avoided music education actively.
Mm.
Um, in a for, in formal music education, I avoided, probably 13 to 20, and then at 20 I was like, what was I doing? Oh my god,
Yeah.
I got to learn some stuff. um,
I'm with
you
you.
know
I'm right
you know
there.
what I mean? Like, I sat down at a piano and I was like, why did you stop thinking about um, and I played catch up.
Yeah.
But um, you know looking back on it now, I am grateful that so many of my so that so many of my kind of foundational experiences with music, i.e., 13 to 20, um, were not formal, because I talk to so many people who have memories of trying to get it right, of being nervous about the recital, of remembering some mistake they made, literally an eighth note
Yeah.
from 15 years old. Um, and I have none of that. Um, uh, Not that I wasn't making mistakes, it's just that the audience was different, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And the goal was different. And I'm kind of glad for that. Um, at its worst, the learning of music can carry with it some trauma. Uh,
Definitely.
but my orientation to music has always been one of like, let's see what happens. There's a song inside of you, guaranteed. I guarantee it.
Hmm.
I've said that to groups like, who thinks we can write a song? And the group's like, I've never written a song. I don't know what. And I say, I guarantee you can write a song. You know, obviously don't worry about harmony right now, harmonic theory or anything, or you don't have to have 20 different chord progressions at the ready. uh, but I guarantee that there's a song inside
Yeah, and I think this goes back to something you said earlier about this self-judgment that people have when being in music, saying,
you.
"Oh, I can't sing. I'm not a musician." Or when you were talking about receptive listening, how
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people come and say, "Oh, I don't play. I'll just listen." I
And
think that
listening's a big deal.
and it is a big deal, but also I think when we say we can't do something, to me, I feel like there's an idea of comparison because at a young age we're said like, oh well, this person is the musician, you
Right,
are not. So when someone
right,
said I'm not a musician, I feel what's really being said is like, I am not a you know Ella Fitzgerald, I am not Frank Sinatra,
sure.
when really it's like, well, but you're you and you have a song within you. It's just like learning any new skill and learning how to do it from who you are
Mm-hmm.
is the therapeutic process.
Right.
And even if it's not within therapy, just the creative process is healing and powerful and a beautiful
Mm-hmm.
experience.
I think it's one of the lessons. I mean, I think each of us, if I can be so bold, struggles with this sense of feeling like we're enough,
Completely, I'm with you.
uh, and that can be encapsulated in all sorts of innocuous um, statements, like you know, I'm not creative.
Mm,
That statement always blew my mind. Like, you know, no matter who you are, throughout each day there are 1,000 creative acts.
mm-hmm.
Without that that flow, um, you know, you wouldn't have made it. You know, so I guess that comes down. Maybe that's a bit of semantics. How are we defining creativity? I never liked that term, a creative. Oh wait, we're just waiting on the creative to show up.
Oh yeah.
Like there's something about that always struck me as a little gross. But
I can feel
um,
that.
yeah, this sense of self-validating and of feeling like enough, of feeling like you know what let's write a song. Well, what would I say? Whatever you say in the moment, that whatever the thing that comes out could be the thing,
Mm-hmm.
you know um and if when people kind of can get on that wavelength, often life can um I certainly find that it just simply makes life a little more thrilling.
Yeah, and you know, I'm trying to come up. This is the first episode of the podcast, and I would like to come up with a name for this. I was thinking of Jon Stewart's like, "Here's your moment of Zen," when
Mm,
he was doing the Daily Show. But you're talking about entering the waves length and like being open to creativity, and I'm wondering if you could share something with our listeners. Um, let's call this the it's almost like it sounds silly, but like moment of enlightenment of something that obviously listening to this podcast is not therapy. um
no.
the therapeutic relationship and what happens within a therapeutic context is completely different, but I do hope that listeners can listen to this and take something away from it that can you know help reduce some stress or help give perspective on some things, or maybe even provide insight on their own therapy journey.
Mm.
And so I'm wondering if you could share something like an idea, main idea, or an action activity that our listeners can try out at home.
I I think we've already hit on it a little when we started to talk about the stories that people tell, and
Mm,
through the statements they make, like, "Oh, I'm not a musician,"
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
for example. I'm not creative, or I am creative. It doesn't have to be negative. And those statements are like commands to the unconscious, to the subconscious. Um,
Wow. Very powerful. Yes.
you know, the stories we tell ourselves are commands
Mm-hmm.
to, the basement of our mind. Um, and so, one of the things I try to do, nowhere near perfectly, is just be aware of my stories as I tell them. Oh, there's that story you tell about that thing. Oh, there's that story you tell about that thing.
Mm.
Um, and in so do, I mean, essentially mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there's my mind doing that thing again. I worked with a social worker when I still did some medical work, um, who said that she, she said there is no truth. There. She said there's only stories and what the story does for the storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, uh, and I started thinking of examples of people denying atrocity or something like that. And I'm like, are you
Yes.
are you telling me that that person's just living their truth, denying denying that ocean of trauma over there, that kind of thing?
Easier than accepting it.
Yeah. And she said, well, she's what I'm saying is that all that we as therapists or anyone really needs to consider is what that denial does for the denier. What does the story do for the storyteller? And
Mm.
when we impose that kind of rigor on ourselves, I think we can get to pretty special places. Oh, there's my mind doing that thing. Why do I tell that story?
Mm.
um, I think it's instead of just swimming in the narratives and accepting them carte blanche, or accepting them a priori.
Mm.
I think it's a really unique thing to do. And as therapists, we are trained to hint at that, piecemeal
Yes.
with our client, to get perspective, right? Um, and with perspective can come change. And so that would be one thing, just as best we can, observing ourselves. And when we start to tell a story to ourselves, to another person, when we start to tell a story about another person,
Mm.
this simple question of, what is this story doing for me? I love that.
I do too.
um, you know what I mean?
Yeah, completely. And I
And then
think,
the other
yeah.
thing is, just in this era of lockdown, and in this era of, you look at the political environment and it's just competing narratives, right?
Mm-hmm.
What does that story about, um, the other do for you?
Right.
Um, and then, but to refocus, in this era of lockdown and this idea of positive change, which is our jobs, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we're therapists, and so we are trying to help a client provoke positive change, a
Yes.
desired change.
Yes.
Or maybe to start, we're trying to help them acquire the willingness,
Mm.
then the desire, and then the change. Probably through a shift in perspective,
Mm-hmm.
or through a competing, maybe they have a negative relationship with themselves and that's not going anywhere, but maybe we can help them foster a positive relationship with themselves, which can then compete against the negative relationship. Give the darkness a run for its money. My God,
Yes.
right?
Totally.
Because the darkness isn't going anywhere. Nobody's that good at healing. um, but just the to provoke change, Uh, Look at actions. One of the great, I was always looking for a thought or an idea or a passage in a book or something that was going to help me think in a new way or gain insight into this thing or that thing. Uh, and I still do that. But I also really am into this idea of changing from the outside in.
Mm,
And that this isn't new. I mean, there's a version of this in cognitive behavioral therapy and in music too, because that can be outside in. You're
yes.
playing on the outside
Mm,
physically,
mm-hmm.
but it's changing you internally. And so changing behaviors, changing actions, changing literal physical movements,
Yeah.
and then observing how that changes over time if you're consistent thoughts and behaviors. Yeah.
Love it. And really am thinking about the idea of storytelling and also just knowing, as you said, like the the stories that we tell ourselves are like commands to our subconscious.
Oh yeah,
These are
yeah.
stories that have been programmed in us from a young age, and
True.
we now, I think what I hear in what you're saying too, have the ability to tell ourselves new stories and
Mm-hmm.
have them have eventually have the same kind of effect as these old stories, not in same kind of effect meaning negative or positive, but just an effect. So if a story we're telling ourselves is hurting us and having that effect, a story that
Yeah.
we tell ourselves can have the opposite effect, and changing those stories and doing that through mindfulness,
Exactly.
like what you're
Exactly.
saying, is a beautiful metaphor, and it's not even a metaphor. It's just real. It's very real, and I
I don't.
yeah.
The second law of thermodynamics does not apply to the heart. You know. You know.
So first, I am not.
Things do not in
What is the second law?
just that things will inevitably move towards disintegration,
Hmm.
and I don't think that is true emotionally or spiritually. Things can fall apart,
Mm-hmm.
or things can come together.
Yes.
It's not the same as out in the natural world in this way. It's something that's kind of distinctly unnatural about us, I think, as spiritual beings.
Yeah.
Um, and, just to talk about narratives, and, you know, each of us, without exception, has narratives inside us which we did not create, but we but we inherited, or in more difficult circumstances, narratives that were installed into us.
Yes.
Now, maybe this is just me, but I find responsibility to be such a huge component in moving away from these things.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't my narrative. This was something. This was a legacy thing, or this was a trauma thing. But it's mine now. I'm the one who's run with it for a while.
Mm-hmm.
So none of the narratives in my head are not mine. That's because that thought to me breeds um hmm. I'm scanning myself right now, and just to say out loud, I feel like I'm reluctant to say this right now, so maybe I should. um
I'm open.
I don't want to imagine that any of the narratives that are going on in my head are not mine,
Mm.
uh, because that reduces my own responsibility, and it can grow any self-pity
Mm.
or victimhood I might have, which reduces my agency. And so that's why I'm mindful of this idea of, like, the narrative might have come from society or from a family dynamic or whatever it is, but it's in the person now.
Yeah.
It's theirs now. They ran with it now. And I think that's an important distinction.
I would agree. And I think that highlights the one of the many paradoxes of the human existence is that not only do we need to own these narratives that are ours, while
Hmm.
also owning that as young people and just throughout our experiences, we were just absorbing these narratives too. So not,
Yes.
to have some forgiveness about these
Oh,
maladaptive
absolutely.
narratives, like, oh, like, it's not my fault, but it is here now, and it is my responsibility to act accordingly. um
Absolutely. It's such a balancing act, right? Because I
yes.
would never want to sweep under the rug the experiences where a person inherited these narratives,
Hmm.
whether from society, uh, telling them what their place was,
Yes.
or their family telling them what their role was. I would never want to erase that.
Mm.
But it's kind of like I heard a rabbi once speak about you know the progression towards resentment. Somebody, you're driving along in your car and somebody cuts you off, and it's natural to, in that moment, experience a flush of rage,
Yes.
right? That is
Hmm.
a normal human reaction.
Hmm.
If 5 days later you're still stewing about that other driver, then then it then it is you who's recalling that thing, uh, and watering that thing and growing that thing and nurturing that thing.
Totally.
um, it all started with somebody else's action, but 5 days later, that's a resentment, right? To resent is to refeel.
Completely. And if
uh,
I could make a plug for a book that actually strongly influenced Buddhist music and the philosophy of Buddhist music, there's a um, book called Buddha's Brain by
mm,
Rick Hansen. And in the book, he talks about this two dart system that we all live in. The first dart being that natural reaction, you stub your toe and you say,
mhm.
ow, right? And the second dart, which is where a lot of us live, is holding on to this, this negativity bias of having that a negative experience stick with us so strongly and so much more powerfully than a positive experience. So now, instead of just being without and letting it kind of disappear, because pain subsides, physical pain subsides, and then the mental pain we is the second dart, where you're like, oh, who moved the chair like this? And then I have so much anger towards people moving the chair, and I hit the chair, and then you live in that, and then it's just this perpetual motion, perpetual emotion of,
I
you know
love that. I love
yeah.
that.
So
Perpetual emotion.
yes. And so that, going back to mindfulness of this, and even stories there, Rafe, that story of removing responsibilities, like, maybe the chair was just there and you stubbed your toe, and that's it. That can be the end of the story. And knowing when to end stories is just as
Mm.
difficult as knowing when to change stories and be aware of them.
Yeah, it's like knowing when a song is done.
Oh yeah, I never know that.
That's a tricky one, right?
It is tricky. Um, and speaking of knowing when songs are done, you are working on a project now, a musical project, and I want to give you the
Mm.
opportunity to promote your music and your creative persona. So if you want to talk about what you're working on and how people can listen to
Sure.
you and get in touch with you.
Sure. Well, yeah, like I said at the beginning, I'm a music therapist, but obviously I've been a musician a lot longer than that.
Mm,
And the current thing I'm working on is under the project name Kiss Attack. And interestingly, I think some of the things we've been talking about in this interview within the context of therapy, I mean, without a doubt, are coming up in these songs. This idea of narratives and whose story is whose,
mhm,
and
mm.
is that mine? Do I need to keep it? Like these things come up uh, in this current batch of songs, again under the project name Kiss Attack. It's in the website is kissattack.com. But again, they are songs, and my goal with my own personal music um, is that in the end they be art, obviously, but also an entertainment. It's one of the things I like about art. Something I was always, for example, Marvin Gaye, "What's Going On," like that
Hmm.
record's about like the end of the world, and yet it's deeply groovy and you could dance to it. Um,
I love that.
and so that kind of magic trick, I always found deeply attractive, and I know that music is uniquely good at pulling that kind of thing off.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, certainly Kiss Attack at kissattack.com. The songs will start to come up pretty soon. They're not yet available, um, but pretty passionate about it, um, and have had a chance to work with some wonderful people, and yeah, they'll be available very soon.
So just to for a quick orientation, today is Friday, September 11th, 2020. I believe I will be posting this later, so hopefully, when you're listening to this, um, it is at that time. But if you're a new listener, be sure to check out kissattack.com. Rafe, thank you so much for being the first guest on the Beautiful Music Presents Going Mental podcast.
Oh,
It's
my
been
pleasure.
such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much. And if you would like to learn more um, about beautiful music, you can always check out beautifulmusic.com, where there are meditations, more information about music therapy, beautiful music therapy, and this podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a peaceful and healthy day. Thank you so much.